Welcome everyone to Asia Back to School and to our session User and Admin Guide for Optimizing Microsoft 365. Here on this slide, you can also see the YouTube channel, which is connected to the Asia Back to School and the link where you can see all our sessions. So before we start, just a couple of words about ourselves. So my name is Gorana Konevska. I'm a Microsoft MVP, also certified trainer, and I have been working with Microsoft for more than 15, let's say 16 years now. And here with me is my colleague and friend, Dimitar. Dimitar, hi.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session. I am the IT Pro part of the story that you're going to listen to today's recording. As Gorana mentioned, Dimitar Grozdanov here. I've been a little bit more in the IT business, 20 plus years, working on various roles. I used to work almost 11 years for Microsoft as well. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of the cloud side. A couple of links where you can reach out with either connect or if you have any additional questions or you want to discuss something else from Gorana's or my part of the session. But also we are both members of the Macedonian IT Pro user group. So we do a lot of sessions during the year, and we can establish some form of collaboration if you're interested. Now, as far as the topics of today, we're going to switch the roles and different views between the user and administrative side of the Microsoft 365 story. I'm going to spend some time on the planning in regards to the business versus the technical requirements and give you some pointers there. Additional quick tips will be part of the session as well, because it's part of either Gorana's or my journey. As right, one side is the adoption, and one side and the business, and the other side would be the IT side. And we're going to streamline some of the lessons we learned during the process. Now, whenever we are talking about doing something, right, we need to figure out what we are going to build, right? And we need to set up the specific cloud foundation, right? Whatever we are trying to build has to serve a very specific purpose. Now, there is a difference if we're talking about infrastructure or platform services compared to Microsoft 365 environment, which is end-to-end software as a service environment. But still, there are a bunch of options, capabilities, components, potential for integration, right? Especially if we have some on-premises infrastructure. So it might be something that we need to integrate with on-premises and then create a hybrid or prepare for a kind of a migration process, right? So whether it's as simple as maybe a house, kind of a bigger object like stadium, building, whatever, or just a simple kind of a stitched bridge, there will be certain effort once we understand what we're trying to build or what solution we're trying to architect, devise, right, deploy and use, then we would need to prepare accordingly, right? Hence, the actual planning of the migration, the adoption, right, of Microsoft 365, it's a very important process which needs to follow a specific planning, right? And it is not only related to the IT operations, it's also related to the business operations, right? Because whatever we decide to do, it will have minimum or some cases huge impact on our users, right? So once we determine what our specific goals are, why we would actually embark on this journey, we need to also decide where do we want to go, right? What are the desired outcomes of whatever set of activities we need to plan and do, right? Then we need to figure out also how do we get there, right? What are the specific strategies we're going to implement? And remember, yeah, in a small and mid-sized organization, that might be a straightforward process. If it's a form of a greenfield, meaning the environment does not have anything specific inside, so we can just start building the cloud environment, then might be a little bit, strategically speaking, easier. But if we're talking about a complex, distributed, dispersed organization, then they would need to have a very streamlined process of how do we do that. In addition to that, we need to also measure what's our success criteria there, right? So yes, we start implementing the strategies and running the course, but what are our measurements and targets there, right? When do we know that we have achieved a specific milestone so we can actually safely continue further, right? Then we also need to look at the results, right? How did we do? What went wrong? What was good? Why some things failed? Why some things were very successful? Maybe we did them ahead of time. But whatever we have as a finding at the end of the day, we have to figure out, right, what the potential improvement would be, and then rinse and repeat, right? Start recycling the process as we move forward with the planning, right? Now, whenever we talk about organization trying to migrate or adopt the Microsoft 365 environment, we start with based on what we have and potentially what we would need to define what Microsoft 365 plan or plans meet your specific organization requirements, right? So there is a couple of options there, not to go into details, but one of the perks of the cloud environment in Microsoft 365 specifically is that we can actually mix different type of subscriptions assigned to the users in our organization to achieve specific goals which match specific business requirements of that group of people, right? Important milestone would be also to inventory the current environment in your organization, right? Starting from the endpoints, what type of devices we have, from the operating system version, the support lifecycle of the OS and the device itself, mobile devices, right? Any external devices would assign access, which are not part of our management infrastructure, up to the way how do we connect? Is it a single location, multiple locations? Do we need additional networking and security requirements to see, right? How do we connect is also important in regards to migrating the data between the on-premises and the cloud environment. Hence, we also need to make specific deployment decisions, especially if we have some on-premises or multiple locations where we have on-premises infrastructure. Then how do we either consolidate first and then move, or how do we initiate the move process? During the inventory and the deployment decision process, we would also discover specific deployment blockers, which means we need to fix them as soon as possible and make sure that nothing would interfere with our mission. In this case, clean up certain organizational structure, right? For example, we might have some stale records in the on-premises Active Directory services. Then we need to provide a baseline configuration of the Microsoft 365 subscription we have chosen, start setting up the accounts and mailboxes, initiate specific migration process of different types of data, right? It might be related to the mailboxes only in some cases, but we might also have a large number of on-premises data repositories like file shares, on-premises SharePoint instances, or third-party software that does the same functionality. We might have third-party cloud services we use for different storage of data, so we might need to initiate migration of the data from that endpoint as well, right? We also need to perform validation of specific functionality, meaning that if we have something similar or some third-party service or component that we used, once we move to the appropriate Microsoft 365 service, we also need to make sure that that functionality meets our specific requirements. Identify the gaps, which also will help us further down the line, as Gorana will explain in the next couple of planning slides, what we need to do in regards to preparing the users for that specific change, right? And last but not least, right, always do training, then migrate a group of users to Microsoft 365. So from an operational standpoint, this is an important thing, right? We do not rush things to Azure or Microsoft 365 just because we are, from an IT standpoint, ready to do and perform the operational task on administering and managing the environment. But we also have the IT support services and other business or technical stakeholders that will be affected by this specific change.
Planning, big topic, Dimitar, right? You mentioned it, and definitely the planning is a stage which should not be underestimated. So it's very important to do a proper planning before we got into the situation where we need to work, where we need to work, how we need to collaborate, etc. So the planning is the first step into this process. Actually, during the planning phase, we define some of the crucial and the basis of how our environment is going to be optimized. And we start with the planning with the question, how do we work at the moment? So we don't want to make a complete change for the users. Yes, we want to make an improvements and better ways to work and to collaborate and to establish a 3 levels higher environment. But let's see, how do we work at the moment? What are the positive sides, the weaknesses, negative sides, etc., so we can make a good improvement? What needs to be improved? This is very important question because users are expecting to see a better environment. IT professionals are expecting to see more secure environment, etc. But we don't need to conflict with the habits of the business users. So that's something that we need to take into consideration during the planning process. So how do we work? What needs to be improved and the habits of the user? Because we don't want to change those habits of the users. We want to make improvement, but if we try to change the habit of the business, then we can easily get fail. So changing the habits can be made on a stages. Then during the planning process, we speak and think about bringing the value of M365. When we would like to introduce the M365 environment for the first time in an organization, then the users have to have a clear view actually of what is the value of Microsoft 365. What are the benefits that the users are going to have? And then we involve the users, so we involve the business users from the first step. So this is not something that IT decides and IT implements, but also we inform and we get the users to be active part, especially maybe one part of the users to be one from the day one part of the planning processes. Because this is not one-way work, it's both ways. It's planning, but it's also involving and getting the feedback about the planning process from the business users as well. Next, how we start is the most important part. So we don't start anything to do in the production environment. We want to plan it on a paper, notepad or whiteboard. So any type of way which you feel comfortable, just do not go directly into the production environment and create things there, because it can easily become a little mess, which you really want to avoid. Then dedicate clear roles. Okay, we are planning to do this and that on the stages, but who is going to be responsible for which part of the project? And it's not just a high-level overview of the project, but we need to have a specific roles for specific tasks and subtasks, something like maybe RACI matrix. So on which stages, due dates, and responsible people for what type of tasks. Then something that you maybe want to consider is having the modern workplace team and some program of champions. So this is during the planning process really important to see who is going to be involved and who is going to support your adoption process. The champions or the ambassadors, this program can be connected with people who are not IT specialists. So they are not an experts in IT. They can be from different departments, but they are just enthusiasts to adopt. They are early adopters of the technology, of the programs, and of the changes. So introducing the modern workplace team together with the ambassador program or the champions program can be from a big benefit also on a long-term run. Then you can split the tasks and you can also include your champions. You can include the program during the adoption process and perform everything on the stages. So this is a journey. This is something that maybe will take months and years, and maybe it never ends actually, because the changes in the company will always reflect changes into the systems, into the services. So making some changes into your environment will have impact on this as well. So it's a journey. It's something that will take time, and you will need a support of the champions, of the people, of the pilot groups. So think about this in the first step, and how do you start? Next, some tips, tricks, and how you can perform. So start small. Always start very, very small. So this is user adoption process. We need to have in focus our users. And first of all, we can start from decide which services are going to be used from the users at the beginning. So you go into Microsoft 365, you migrate. You need to decide which tool or which couple of tools are going to be used at the beginning. You cannot use all the tools from the package, especially not in the first stage. So decide, are you going to start with the SharePoint, Outlook, introduce Teams, then you will go with OneDrive a little bit later on the next stage. So where do you actually start? Then the next step would be to create an adoption plan or program. So you will start with some tools. How are you going to introduce them to your business users, and how you are going to be sure that the business users understood the nature of these tools, how they are using the tools actually? Do they have enough knowledge? Because if they don't, then you can end up with a lot of frustrated people who are not just aware how to use these services. That would be a good idea then to create, before you start with the adoption, to create the webinars and trainings, to have the content, milestones, and clear path. And then on the next step, maybe you should think about the onboarding space. So you are onboarding all of the users, but you will have in the future new users, maybe starting to work into your company, into different departments, and then you would like to share this some onboarding space where you have all the trainings and all the materials connected to your Microsoft 365 environment. Community. Yes, very, very nice word and widely used, the community, and think about organizing it. So the community will give you a lot of information from both sides. So from the business, but also the IT departments can add and contribute to the business users community. And from that community, you can just pick a lot of information, and in the community, you can absolutely set up a feedback process. So the users can always get back to the IT department and have a feedback about these services, positive or negative, or something like an idea how to proceed, and you will know the direction of your services.
All right. As far as the adoption and planning goes, completely agree with Goran on the side, as not only of the users, but also the IT pro side. It's not only the involvement in the community side, but it's also sharing feedback and learning from each other as well. Now, going back to the technical side of the story, quite a few migration processes I had a chance to run and work with different customer sizes. One of the things that was kind of a tripping point was actually the network side. So analyzing the network considerations for at least mail migration or any portion of the migrations, it's an important step to be discussed and as well properly tested. Also, any form of gap or issues found need to be resolved before we start anything as a process. Maybe during a proof of concept, the POC or some test migrations, we can actually do some measurements there. But once we start a kind of a major operation of moving mailboxes, then network would be a crucial and critical point of the process, right? So we're not talking only about the network capacity, we're also talking about network stability and potentially network delays that might interfere with the process and cause some specific issues inside. Now, yeah, Microsoft has documented the process. It's also very important which type of migration approach we run. Do we look at IMAP migration, cutover, staged, hybrid, right? Any form of a third-party migration there, it's part of our decision. It's also important in some cases, maybe cross-tenant migration, which is a functionality that helps, which has a different notion there, right? But if we're talking about on-premises to cloud side of migration, I'm going to keep some time talking about the mail side, right? We might have multi-geographical distribution, right? Multinational companies with offices all around the world, even in a kind of a targeted geographical region. There will be a different network capacity, network stability, network delays, depending on the region we're working on, right? Also, encryption of the data. Yes, when we move the data to the cloud side, we do rely on the cloud encryption capabilities of the Microsoft 365 services, but I've seen customers that actually require their own customer keys to be onboarded, which means we also need to take that in consideration in that environment, as well as, last but not least, the geolocation of the specific Microsoft 365 data center, right? In certain geographies, they do have the luxury having a Microsoft data center close by or fairly close by, but in some cases, we might rely on a few hundred kilometers from the closest data center, although Microsoft maintains a highly connected network between the data center we're going to move from up to the location where we are actually from our local ISP there. But still, there are also options to consider if might be one option to use an express route as part of the process, right? Now, as far as the network capacity goes, right, there will be a time frame which will take us some time to migrate mailboxes to Microsoft 365, which is related directly to the maximum capacity of the specific network, right? So if it's a leased line, if it's certain capacity, then we're pretty straightforward there, and we're sure. But I've seen quite a few scenarios where people use an ADSL line, which is an asymmetrical one, which means the download speed is usually 10 to 15, 20 times higher than the upload speed that can be achieved to that specific internet connectivity, right? Another thing would be network stability. Right? So having a fast network does not result always in having a fast migration. If we have breakings, network is not that stable, data transfers take longer because of error connection. Asymmetrical links might be here. Well, it's not directly related to stability, but then we might have scenarios. So back home, we have a scenario where one of the local ISPs actually resets the IP address of your ADSL link on a 24-hour time frame, which means depending when the last reset was, it will happen sometimes during the day, maybe during the night. But once we initiate the migration process, it will run within a certain time frame, which means if the breaking occurs, there will be a break in the migration, right? Another thing that we need to take in consideration is the network delays. Right? That's directly related to how do we get from the on-premises mailbox environment, then through which appliances and devices we need to go through, right? There might be a multiple firewall scenarios. We might have a proxy service and a firewall combination, or all three at the end of the day. That might cause a specific delay. Depending on the network structure, we might have a scenario also where we route the traffic from our branch offices to the HQ, and then we go out, which means multiple firewalls. Might be a scenario with international organization where they use closed loop circuits in form of a VPN, for example, which means we already have a limited network capacity, and we might have additional delays when we do the data migration process, right? And again, any form of intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, antivirus software that will be there might cause, right, certain delays because of the inspection of the data that traverses, right? So in general, we have to be careful. We need to test that, and we need to be aware that once we initiate the process, it will take some time, right? So there is a kind of a depending on the type of the migration, there is some form of estimation that Microsoft provides how long it will take us to migrate certain chunks of data, right? So for example, depending on what we choose, whether it's IMAP, cutover, stage, hybrid, do we use third-party type of services, and then we need to migrate to Microsoft 365. So there will be a form of throttling applied from the Microsoft 365 service side, right? It also depends on what's the chunk of data we try to move, right? So the calculation of the approximate gigabytes that are actually can be sent, it's based on 20 user mailboxes in this case to be migrated through the MRS proxy service, right? From on-premises to the cloud side. Again, also take in consideration when you create the migration batches to make sure. So it's not necessarily that a large mailbox would go slower than a smaller mailbox. So if I have, I don't know, a 10 gigabyte mailbox and then I have one of 2 gigabytes, then the one with 2 gigabytes will go faster. It's also important to note how many items we have in the mailbox, especially if those items have attachments inside, right? We might assume that before we move to Microsoft 365, we maybe use SharePoint links as well as OneDrive links to share data between the users. There has been a lot of attachments running, which might comply with some limitation we assign in the with the policies on the on-premises organization, but still we might have a 2 gigabyte mailbox with, I don't know, 11,000 items inside, and each one of those has an attachment inside, right? So that will take significant more time compared to, I don't know, a 10 gigabyte mailbox with 3,000 items inside. So when we create the migration batches, and we can create multiple batches at the same time, right, through the in the proxy service on the CAS side, and we initiate them, kind of a step-by-step process. Make sure that you look at the items as well as the size of the mailbox before we initiate. So create a grouping based on that. Either way, you should consider that in regards to the migration. So Microsoft estimates that when we are talking from an on-premises to the cloud side of the migration for 0 to 10 gigabytes of mailbox size, we would need a day, right? Whether we're looking at a PST import, generic IMAP onboarding, I don't know, we have specialized Gmail onboarding, even with cross-tenant communication, etc. We need a 1 day to do it, to get to the kind of a 50 percentile duration, right? If you look at the 90 percentile, then that can span between 1 day and it can go up to 3 days, depending on the service from where we migrate the data from. So taking in consideration the networking, should we consider this an important step? It should be looked immediately when we start planning, right? When we're at the beginning steps of our process. We need to do proper tests. In some cases, the governance risk compliance teams might not be keen on doing some changes on the environment just for the sake of the migration process. So this is something that needs to be addressed soon into the process to inform the business decision makers, the specific project sponsor there, so we can have kind of clear the red tape in the actual process. And again, needless to say, any form of IT Pro trainings and should be a component within the process, meaning that once we start discussing with different teams and aspects of the migration, everybody there should be aware of what we're talking about, and within their areas of expertise, they can bring something to the table.
Okay, and some additional quick tips. So when you think about doing the migration, and then you're doing this planning, and think about who should have which privileges in Microsoft 365. So maybe the IT department is very small, maybe it's really big. Then you should consider which person or which people we will have which types of privileges from the admin aspect. So it's not a good approach, for an example, to have 10 global admins, but who is going to manage which part of M365 and what type of privileges these users are going to have from the admin aspect. But also, when we speak about privileges or restrictions, we should take consideration the business users and their side as well. So who is going to be available, or who is going to be have privileges to work in which environment or do what from the business user aspect as well. For an example, if the company where you work is very large organization, it's enterprise, and then you have a lot of users, maybe it would be a good approach to close the team's creation, the group's creation, because if everybody can create a team, then you will end up in a countless and maybe unused teams and groups in your admin center. So this is something that needs to be taken in consideration about the next steps. And of course, the communication should be always both ways, user and IT department. So the user should be aware what they're permitted or restricted to do. Then another tip is about sharing outside of the organization. So regarding the nature of your work, especially the nature of your organization, you should consider how you're going to share outside of the organization and how you're going to invite people from outside of your organization to collaborate within your employees into your environment. Then, of course, one very important tip is to continuously monitor the activities of the users, and that's the only way how you can improve your environment, the feedback and monitoring of the activities. So setting up a governance process is highly recommended. And it will be ideally if you set up the governance process from the very beginning. So when you do the planning and the migration, and then you have the governance right away from the first day. That would be ideally. Then about the expiration policies, think about creating the expiration policies for the groups so you can keep your space clean, which means that, for an example of the period of time of 6 months or 1 year, depends on how your company works. Maybe you can set up these policies and the system will run a checkup for inactivity, and then the space will be clean of all of those inactive groups. And last but not least, a test environment is a must. So this is something that will allow you to test the things before you go to the production. So test environment in every point of meaning. So not just test from the IT aspect, but it would be good if you have some test environment for your business users. So every time a business user is not sure how to do something, for example, in SharePoint online, they can go into this test environment and they can freely do every task there before they do into the production environment. And consideration for external user sharing. So we have a strategy, we are planning, and then we need to include this, how you share your content with external users. So this is a very important topic, no matter of the size of the organization we are talking about. We always have some people from outside of the organization who need to receive some data from us, or they need to access and collaborate. So who needs to have access to which site or subsite? And do they need an access to entire environment or site, or just one part, or just one folder, or do they only need access to view a specific document? So this is some consideration that your users also need to be aware of. So which users in your organization need to be able to share content with external users? This is also something that needs to be taken into consideration, especially if you are a company from a larger range and you have many users. So you maybe want to create a groups and then assign these permissions to these different types of groups. And again, so is a governance in place? So do you have a governance project or a board or a people who are going to be responsible? Because the governance is very, very large topic, and it definitely includes this collaboration and sharing with external users.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I agree completely with what Gorana said. And yes, there are some form of common errors and some best practices to prevent certain things to happen in the organization. Because remember, the Microsoft 365 as a service and all other components there as part of different subscriptions that you might have in the bundle are primarily focused on collaboration, communication, which means certain openness exists in the configuration of the service. Yes, as time progresses, Microsoft enforces specific security and governance models on top of it, but still, once we provision the tenant, it is hosted in the Microsoft environment, it is protected, right? We get the software as a service as is, which means any application or coding errors or service errors that are there will be managed and maintained by the Microsoft operational teams. But whatever we configure inside the actual Microsoft 360 tenant is up to us, right? And again, as Goran emphasized, it's important to plan what external users can see and access, right? So by default, if you look at the SharePoint Online, it is quite open, right? The default setting there is for collaboration and sharing the information, which means there are certain things that the external users can do, which we might not be happy with it from an IT perspective, but also our security and governance teams, right? So during the initial planning process, if we need to add external users for different reasons, so it might be some external consultants, some external form of vendors, or whatever we have, companies we have contracts with that need to access specific components inside our Microsoft 365 infrastructure, not only from an IT operations perspective, but also from a user perspective. It means that, yeah, we need to plan what they can see, what they can interact with, and if they need to access it, how they access it, right? Whenever we are thinking of sharing with external users, consider creating a site that will be used just for that purpose, which means any security matrix and model we apply, any governance, any monitoring, backup, whatever, it will be adjusted to accommodate these external users. Always be exercising security awareness, right? So yes, certain Microsoft 365 plans do have the option to run security drills in form of a spear phishing attacks and any other form of attachment type of attacks we can train the organization with. But either way, it's not only that, it's also continually informing and running the training and educational process and awareness process of our users. Yes, there will be gaps always. Remembering in the back days when I worked for different companies, I was on both sides actually. I was running the security awareness things by sending a kind of a honeypot type of emails and then assess how many people clicked on the link or submitted some data through the form. Then based on that, we did security awareness trainings. There was quite a few mandatory trainings, but I've been also on the user side where different people administered the organization and did the same thing. And frankly, it's very difficult to determine when that's a kind of a fake type of a email that you got, or it's something that's real and can present a clear danger to the environment. Always set the appropriate permissions. Yes, depending on the Microsoft 365 subscription, and then in the background, whatever Enter ID subscription we have, formerly Azure Active Directory, right? Basic premium type. We have certain capabilities in how we manage the subscription in a kind of a more automated way. But certain organizations manage that on one hand by creating appropriate security groups, assigning the users. But I've seen a lot of scenarios where actually the permissions are assigned directly to the user. And then to conserve time and efforts, they have very high level of privileges in the system. So permission-wise, check whatever Microsoft 365 roles, depending on the service you're looking, you can assign to the user so they can do just enough actions on top of the resources they access. The same applies for the security group side that can be managed through the Enter ID side. Right, and as Gorana mentioned previously, right, do not overdo it, right? Do not have 10 global admins in the environment, so they can do a lot of damage. Always keep a break the glass administrator somewhere which has no additional security constraints in regards to how they authenticate to the system, so you can actually kind of control the damage and manage the functionality of the tenant if something happens, right? Ensure that you know the identity of any external user assigned, which means, yes, there should be a process who would have assigned specific access from the external users. There are certain capabilities which are part of the Entra ID governance with the entitlement packages. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Can be very useful in these scenarios. In regards to sharing team site content, consider creating a subsite for the shared content, again, to limit specific privileges. Also, in regards of teams, I've seen a few organizations where they actually, based on the governance model that also Gorana mentioned, they have different setup for groups, right? Or in teams, depending whether there is an external user in that specific virtual team that works on specific task there, right? So they had naming conventions, but also a well-established governance model when they provision specific teams environment for project members that are on one side only organizational employees, or on the other side it's a mixed team there inside. You should also be aware that external users in some cases do not receive the invitation email due to different transportation security components, including spam filters, which means they might not have access. And in few cases, I've seen that resending the invitation is a must, right? Be aware that you should consider splitting the site collections between internal and external users to ease the management, right? Might be seen as overwhelming due to the multiple sites and then have multiple environments to manage. But then again, it's easier, right? I have a kind of a sensitive content which is only for internal users, and then I expose certain content to external users. And last but not least, please be aware of the capabilities of the access governance reports, which unfortunately come with Microsoft 365 E5 or A5 plan. So if you have something like that, please use it. Now, initially, you don't need to deploy it, but once you get to a certain stage, it's a thing to consider. As far as the additional security concerns, and this is the ultimate fight between business and IT groups, and this needs to be discussed, and then appropriate trainings to be accommodated for both IT and user. We have the multi-factor authentication, which is a must these days. In case of managed devices, right, we need to determine what trusted devices, and based on that, create appropriate conditional access policies to kind of secure end-to-end the environment. And then last but not least, the data loss prevention policies, especially with the unified labeling capabilities that were introduced a while ago. We can actually unify that process and maintain visibility and control on whatever it's exchanged, shared, or distributed to the organization as a piece of information, right? Now, I mentioned the identity management side, right? So we are primarily looking through the Microsoft 365, although, right, the Enter ID portal is the same, whether we're talking about Azure or Microsoft 365. Manage the application and resource access by using the appropriate security groups. Right. One of the oldest models that popped up in Active Directory in Windows Server 2000 was the AGDLP. Accounts are assigned to global groups are assigned to domain local groups, and then we assign the privileges. Now, in case of a hybrid scenarios, we might have already that structure, but again, I've seen quite a lot of examples where users are directly assigned to the specific role in the system. Now, that might not be an issue if we use premium subscription, right, on the Azure Active Directory and ID, where we have the capabilities of doing access reviews and then revoke and dynamically assign access, right? But smaller orgs that have kind of an entry-level type of service there, they might not have this capability. AD Connect filters, well, with the recent update, right? The default system, local system accounts that exist for on-premises operations are not synchronized, but we might have created specific accounts for specific purpose that only runs inside the on-premises domain structure. Do not synchronize those with cloud. So they're not used there, but they potentially can be breached, right? Any form of security defaults in Enter ID can be used, especially if we don't have a premium subscription, right? So these are the default settings requiring all users to register for Entra ID multi-factor authentication. Requiring administrators to use multi-factor authentication. And remember, we exclude the account we have created for only break the glass purposes. So yeah, that one should be excluded from any conditional access policy, multi-factor authentication, things like so. I have seen several times issues with those accounts, especially when the IT administrator forgets there is an MFA on account they use and they try to run scripts. And the scripts fail because there is no MFA prompt in that area. Requiring users to do MFA authentication when necessary, right? Again, there are multiple ways how to configure it. It's now integrated in through the Entra ID environment, so there is no separate portal for setting up the MFA anymore. So be aware of the capabilities and what it can be done in conjunction with the conditional access policies as well. Then protection of any privileged activities, right? Access to the Azure portal implies the Entra ID side. But we can also, depending if we have Azure subscription embedded, also running PowerShell or CLI and who can execute commands there. Again, needless to stress, more conditional access for users and then implement the zero trust framework model. And securing external collaboration in Microsoft Entra ID and Microsoft 365, which implies not only appropriate privileges or appropriate structuring of our shared content, whether it's in Teams, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, whatever, but also appropriate security, group membership, as well as appropriate roles assigned. I mentioned the entitlement management, which has been there for a while and has been for a long time really kind of the underdog, so it's not that popular. The idea here would be to control who can access to the specific applications, groups, including Teams, SharePoint styles inside. It has a multi-stage approval process that can be defined users, and it ensures us that at the end of the day that users don't retain the access indefinitely, because there is a time limit of this, and then it has the recurring access reviews, right? Another thing, it's also giving users access automatically to specific resources based on specific users' properties, right? Can be department, cost center, type of user, right? Some things here are in preview, but it will be hopefully soon enough out of the preview. You can also delegate any node administrators the ability to create these access packages and maintain them, right? It's not necessary that an IT administrator would maintain the package, might be relevant to specific business unit. So implies that, right, the package will contain specific resources that users can request, and the delegated access package managers can define policies with rules how the access can be assigned, who would do the approval, right, and when the access will expire. We can also integrate with connected organizations, right? Which means anything that's part of the connected organizations pool can invoke a request access process, right? Which means that when a user who isn't yet in your directory, so that can be during scenarios where we don't only collaborate with the other side, but we also have procured different another organization, so we integrate and we start onboarding the users. When a user who isn't yet in your specific directory request a specific access, and once it's approved, they will be automatically invited into the your directory and then assign that specific access. Once that access expires, if they do not have any access package assigned, right, their business-to-business account in your directory will be automatically removed. So in general, it is a very useful capability. If you haven't looked at it, please do. It's a very straightforward process how to create it. And again, I've seen quite a few organizations that do have some form of entitlement management, but then using the built-in functionality in Enter ID for this. All right, so I think we reached the end of the session. So there are a couple of links. Yeah, you might see the nomenclature here that are also in the slides, but it can be right here. I kind of compile them here, which are related to specific IT Pro side of the story. This would be all from my side. Again, thank you again for being on our session. If you have any specific questions, please reach out to the social media mentioned at the beginning. Please circle back to the YouTube channel and check out other sessions as well, or look at the schedule on the Azure Back to School. So there is a combination of articles, recorded and live sessions that you can have. That will be all from my side. And Gorana.
Yeah, thank you all for listening to our session, and hope to see you soon.